Welcome back to Revenge Pains. I'm Serena. Sometimes the deepest betrayals aren't inflicted by the enemy you expect, but by the brother standing next to you. In the freezing, mud-caked confines of a German prisoner of war camp during World War II, honor wasn't just a word. It was the last currency they had. Today's story, the Offlog Cipher, is about a man who discovers that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the gun pointed at him, but the one who shares his uniform, his language, and his supposed allegiance. It's a story about what happens when the sacred code of brotherhood is shattered, and one man's quest for vengeance becomes a desperate search for a justice more profound than any escape. This one gets intense, so settle in. In the stinking, crowded barracks of Offlog 7C, hope was a flickering candle in a hurricane. For Flight Lieutenant Alastair Finch, that candle was his friendship with David. Alastair, a former history teacher whose hands were more accustomed to chalk dust than the grip of a Spitfire's joystick, found an unlikely kindred spirit in the boisterous, ever-optimistic David. Where Alastair was quiet, observant, and methodical, David was all laughter and brute force optimism, a necessary son in their shared gray world. They were an odd pair, the scholar and the scrapper, but their bond was forged in the fire of aerial combat and tempered in the crushing boredom and despair of captivity. The camp itself was a universe of mud and barbed wire, a bleak etching against the Bavarian sky. It was a place designed to break men, not with overt, constant brutality, but with the slow, grinding erosion of the soul. The days bled into one another, marked only by the watery cabbage soup, the twice-daily roll call, and the ever-present German guards in their field-gray uniforms, their faces etched with a weary superiority. Yet within this cage, the prisoners had built a society, a microcosm of the world they'd left behind, governed by an unwritten but ironclad constitution. The first and most sacred law was solidarity. You did not steal from a fellow prisoner. You shared what little you had from Red Cross parcels. You never, ever, under any circumstances, collaborated with the Germans. Betrayal was a sin beyond comprehension, a moral stain that no one believed a British officer was capable of. It was simply unthinkable. Their shared project, their secret act of defiance, was a tunnel nicknamed the Mole. It was David's brainchild, born from a reckless courage that Alastair secretly admired and openly worried about. The work was grueling, a subterranean battle against clay, stone, and the constant fear of discovery. They dug with scavenged tools, a broken shovel head, a sharpened bed frame, even soup tins, in the suffocating darkness beneath Hut 17. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and sweat, a primitive, earthy scent that was a welcome change from the sour stench of unwashed bodies and despair above ground. Down in the tunnel, their roles were as defined as they had been in the sky. David was the muscle, the relentless engine of their progress, his broad shoulders shifting tons of earth one painstaking sandbag at a time. Alastair was the architect, the strategist. He calculated the angles, managed the disposal of the soil, a logistical nightmare in itself, and coordinated with the stooges who kept watch for the German patrols they called ferrets. Every inch of progress was a victory, every foot a blow against the Reich. In the claustrophobic confines of the Mole, surrounded by the cold, silent earth, they felt a sense of purpose that transcended their captivity. They weren't just prisoners, they were engineers of their own freedom. "Another foot, Al," David would whisper, his voice muffled by the dark, his face caked in mud. "By Christmas, we'll be drinking real beer in a proper pub. My treat." Alastair would force a smile he couldn't feel. His idealism, the very quality that had propelled him to enlist, was being eroded by the grim reality of their situation. He detaught his students about the clear lines of history, the righteous wars, the noble sacrifices. But here, the lines were blurred. The enemy was not just the guard in the watchtower, but the despondency that crept into your bones, the gnawing hunger, the slow decay of hope. Yet, seeing David's unwavering belief, Alastair allowed himself to borrow a little of that light. He focused on the patterns, the logistics, the comforting certainty of mathematics and physics. He could control the shoring of the walls, the dispersal of the excavated dirt, the timing of the shifts. This was his war now. Their society had its own hierarchies. The senior British officer, or SBO, was a man named Wing Commander Davies, a career officer whose ramrod posture seemed immune to the damp and the degradation. He ran the camp's internal affairs with a quiet authority, a bulwark against chaos. Then there were the committees. The Escape Committee, which officially sanctioned and supported escape attempts, the Theater Committee, which staged surprisingly elaborate plays to keep morale up, and Alastair's own unofficial domain, the Coded Communications Committee. It was his job to vet outgoing letters, embedding intelligence in seemingly innocuous family correspondence, information about German troop movements gleaned from new prisoners, details on factory locations, anything that could help the war effort. It was a role that suited his meticulous nature perfectly. The unwritten law here was that all escape attempts, even private ones like the Mole, had to be logged with the Escape Committee to avoid conflicts and ensure resources were managed. David had resisted. The more people who know, the more risk, Al, he'd argued. This is our show. But Alastair, ever the believer in systems and order, had insisted. It's the code, David. We're part of a whole. Davies needs to know. The committee needs to know. That's how we win, not as individuals, but together. Reluctantly, David had agreed. Alastair had presented their plan to the Escape Committee, a small group of senior officers who met in the cramped camp library, the air thick with the smell of old paper and pipe smoke. Among them was Captain Julian Croft, an army officer with a languid, almost bored-looking demeanor. Croft came from a wealthy family, and it was an open secret he'd pulled strings to get his commission. He always seemed just a little too clean, his uniform a little too pressed. He listened to Alastair's plan with a detached air, asking a few pointed questions about their disposal method that struck Alastair as unusually insightful. At the time, he'd chalked it up to a keen mind. The committee gave their blessing, and the Mole became a semi-sanctioned project, a symbol of the camp's collective defiance. This should have been a comfort. Instead, a tiny, unidentifiable splinter of unease lodged itself in Alastair's mind. He had followed the code. He had done the right thing. But in Offlog 7C, doing the right thing was no guarantee of survival. The night was starless and cold, the air so thick with frost it seemed to crackle with every breath. It was the night of the escape, a perfect night. The moon was shrouded in a thick blanket of clouds, and a low-lying fog hugged the ground, muffling sound and obscuring the sightlines from the guard towers. Down in the tunnel, the air was electric with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Alastair and David were at the tunnel face, just a few feet of earth separating them from the dark woods beyond the wire. Every nerve in Alastair's body was humming, his history teacher's mind a whirlwind of dates and battles, all of them pale abstractions compared to this visceral, heart-pounding reality. David gave him a final, grime-streaked grin, his eyes shining in the dim light of their fat lamp. "See you on the other side, Professor," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "First rounds on me." They broke through the surface. The scent of pine needles and damp earth flooded the tunnel, a smell so rich with freedom it was dizzying. David went first, scrambling out of the hole with a practiced speed. Alastair followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were out. They were actually out. For a split second, standing in the deep shadow of the pine forest, Alastair felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. The world was vast and dark and full of possibility. Then the world exploded. Searchlights erupted from the guard towers, pinning them in merciless cones of white light. The shocking, guttural sound of German shouts tore through the night. "Halt! Hend Hock!" Dogs began to bark, a frantic, terrifying sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was a perfectly laid trap. They weren't just waiting, they were expecting them. The guards were not at the wire, but fanned out in the woods, precisely where the tunnel emerged. Chaos erupted. David, reacting with the pure instinct of a fighter pilot, shoved Alastair back towards the hole. "Go! Get back!" he yelled, his voice a raw command over the din. But there was nowhere to go. Gunfire ripped through the air, the sound a brutal staccato against the frantic barking. Alastair saw David spin, a strange, clumsy dance, and then fall to his knees. A dark stain was spreading across the front of his worn wool tunic. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Alastair scrambled towards his friend, the academic in him evaporating, replaced by a primal need to protect, to help. "David!" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the noise. A rifle butt slammed into his side, knocking the wind out of him and sending him sprawling onto the cold, hard ground. He looked up, dazed, his face pressed against the pine needles. He saw David, trying to push himself up, his face a mask of confusion and pain. He saw a German officer, his face illuminated by the harsh glare of a searchlight, standing over David. There was no malice in the officer's expression, just a kind of weary finality. He raised his pistol, the sound of the shot shockingly intimate, a dull pop that seemed to sever the connection between Alistair and the world. David's body went still. The light in his eyes, the irrepressible, optimistic light that had been Alistair's candle in the dark, was extinguished. Alistair felt nothing. A profound, hollow emptiness washed over him, a cold tide that drowned out the shouting, the barking, the pain in his ribs. He was being dragged, his boots scraping uselessly against the forest floor. He was being hauled back towards the wire, back towards the cage. But his mind was still back there, in the woods, kneeling beside the body of his best friend. As they shoved him through the camp gates, the other prisoners silent and stunned at the windows of their huts, one thought solidified in the chilling vacuum of his grief, hardening from a suspicion into a diamond-hard certainty. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a fluke. They hadn't been discovered. They had been betrayed. The days that followed David's death were a blur of numb despair. Alistair moved through the motions of camp life like a ghost, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He answered to roll call, he drank the thin soup, he stared at the barbed wire. But the man who was Alistair Finch, the history teacher, the idealist, was gone. In his place was something colder, something harder. Grief was a fire, and it had burned away everything extraneous, leaving only the cold ash of a single, obsessive purpose. Find the man who sold David to the Germans. He feigned a complete breakdown. He let his shoulders slump, let his gaze remain vacant. He was seen shuffling through the mud, muttering to himself, a man broken by the loss of his friend and the failure of their escape. It was a convincing performance, born of a genuine, soul-crushing sorrow. But beneath the facade of despair, a different kind of man was being born. The methodical, observant teacher was transforming into a detective. He replayed every conversation, every meeting, every detail of the plan, searching for the discordant note, the single thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire tapestry of betrayal. His investigation began where David's life had ended, at the mouth of the mole. The Germans, in their usual thorough manner, had dynamited the tunnel, leaving a muddy, water-filled crater. In the days after the failed escape, Alistair would wander near the edge of the woods, a picture of aimless grief. The guards ignored him. He was no longer a threat. Under the watchful but uninterested eyes of the sentries, he scoured the ground, his gaze sweeping back and forth with a hawk's intensity. He was looking for something that didn't belong, an anomaly in the landscape of their failure. And then he found it. Tucked partially under a pine root, almost invisible against the dark, damp earth, was a single hand-rolled cigarette. It was pristine, unsmoked, and crucially, not a standard-issue prisoner-of-war ration. The prisoners had their meager supply of victory cigarettes from the Red Cross, flimsy things that tasted of hay and desperation. This one was different. It was plump, expertly rolled, and the tobacco visible at the end was dark and aromatic. It was German tobacco. Specifically, the kind favored by the camp commandant, a fastidious, almost dandyish officer named Oberst Bauer. Alistair knew this because he had seen Bauer offering them to the Red Cross representative during an official inspection. They were a luxury, a symbol of privilege. And in Offlog 7C, privilege came from only one source: collaboration. The cigarette was a reward, a down payment, perhaps, or a small token of gratitude for services rendered. The traitor hadn't smoked it here. That would have been too risky. He must have dropped it, a moment of carelessness in the exhilarating aftermath of his treachery. Alistair scooped it up, his fingers closing around it. The small cylinder felt heavy in his palm, heavy with the weight of David's death. This was his first piece of concrete evidence. His grief, which had been a wild, chaotic storm, began to crystallize. It hardened into a cold, calculated obsession. He was no longer just mourning, he was hunting. He dissected the camp's social structure in his mind. Who had access to the commandant? Who had a motive? Who, among the brotherhood of officers, could be so morally bankrupt? His thoughts circled back to the escape committee meeting, to the men who had been privy to the final details of the mole. There were 5 of them apart from himself. Wing Commander Davies, the SBO, was beyond reproach, a man whose entire being was woven from the fabric of honor. Squadron Leader Miles, a bulldog of a man who had been shot down over the channel. Lieutenant Commander Allen, a stoic naval officer. And Captain Julian Croft. Croft, the man with the languid air and the perfectly pressed uniform. The man who always seemed to have an extra bar of soap, a fresh pack of cards, a supply of those excellent German cigarettes. He'd seen Croft smoking them occasionally, discreetly, cupping the cigarette in his hand as if to hide it. At the time, Alistair had assumed he was trading for them on the black market, bartering his family's gold signet ring or some other personal treasure. But now, that innocent explanation seemed laughably naive. Croft's privileges weren't bought with treasures, they were bought with lives. The motive was simple, and all the more disgusting for its simplicity. Comfort. Croft, the product of a life of ease, was constitutionally incapable of enduring hardship. He saw the war as a lost cause, a pointless charade of honor that he wanted no part of. A few words to the commandant in exchange for a warm blanket, better food, and the promise of staying put, avoiding transfer to the truly hellish camps on the Eastern Front. To a man like Croft, a man with no soul, David's life was a small price to pay for a comfortable mattress. The rage that filled Alistair was so cold, so pure, it was almost serene. He knew his enemy. He had his first clue. The game was afoot. He now had to find a way to prove it, to build a case that would not only satisfy his own need for vengeance but would be irrefutable in the eyes of the other prisoners. He could not go to the SBO with a single cigarette and a suspicion. He needed more. He needed to lay a trap as perfectly as the one that had killed David, and he would be patient. He would watch. He would wait. The former history teacher, armed with a German cigarette and a broken heart, had become the most dangerous man in Offlog 7C. Alistair's quiet, methodical hunt for proof transformed him. The vacant stare was now a finely honed tool, his feigned aimlessness a cover for a relentless surveillance of Captain Julian Croft. He watched the man's every move, memorizing his routines, the people he spoke to, the subtle ways he maintained his privileged existence. He was a spider, spinning an invisible web of observation, and Croft was the fly. The rage and grief were still there, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface, but now they were channeled, focused, given purpose. This was no longer just about David. This was about the sanctity of the code, the fundamental principle of brotherhood that Croft had desecrated. The breakthrough came from the most mundane of sources, the camp library. It was Alistair's nominal domain, the hub of his coded communications committee. It was a dusty, quiet sanctuary, and Croft, a man who prided himself on his supposed intellectualism, was a frequent visitor. He would lounge in one of the less damaged armchairs, ostentatiously reading Goethe or Schiller, a performance of cultural superiority for an audience of none. Alistair, sorting through new arrivals of donated books, observed him from behind the shelves. He noticed that Croft had a peculiar habit. After browsing, he would leave a list of requested books for the librarian, a fellow prisoner named Arthur. These lists were always a mix of classic literature and obscure military history tomes. Alistair's finely tuned instincts for pattern recognition, honed by years of teaching and now sharpened by his quest, began to scream at him. There was something asterisk off about these lists. They were too specific, too eclectic. One day, feigning a need to check the inventory, Alistair got a look at one of Croft's recent requests before Arthur could process it. It was a slip of paper with 4 books listed. The 39 Steps by John Buchan, A History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, On the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, and a Dryasdust Artillery Manual, German Gunnery Tactics, 1917. Standing there in the quiet, musty air of the library, Alistair felt a jolt, a flash of insight so intense it almost made him gasp. It wasn't about the books themselves. It was a cipher. He was the camp's expert in coded messages, after all. He took the list and hurried back to his bunk, his mind racing. He experimented with different methods. Book codes were common, but simple ones were easily broken. It had to be something more subtle. He tried acrostics, Keyword shifts, numerical substitutions based on page numbers. Nothing worked. Frustrated, he laid the list on his small, rickety table. 39 steps, Peloponnesian War, Gallic War, gunnery tactics. The titles stared up at him, and then he saw it. It wasn't the words, it was the numbers, the 39 steps, 39. He scribbled it down. What about the others? The Peloponnesian War that was fought between Athens and Sparta. The key conflict lasted 27 years. He wrote down 27. The Gallic Wars, Caesar's famous campaign, 8 years. He wrote down 8. The Artillery Manual, 1917. The last year of its relevance, or perhaps the year of publication. He wrote down 1917. His list of numbers was 39, 27, 8, 1917. It was meaningless. He was about to give up when his eyes fell on the title again. German Gunnery Tactics. What if the number wasn't a year? What if it was a page number, or a coordinate? This was the key. Then he remembered Croft's unusually sharp questions during the escape committee meeting. He had asked about the tunnel's final bearing. Alastair had given it as 39 degrees northeast. 39. The 39 steps. It all clicked into place. The book titles were a two-part code. The first part of the title referred to a piece of information, and the number in the title, or a number associated with it, was the value of that information. The history of the Peloponnesian War was not about years, it was about the asterisk end asterisk. The end of the tunnel. David had been the 27th man to try escaping from Hut 17 since the camp opened. That was a number only the escape committee and the camp record keepers would know. The Gallic Wars was about the exit point. The tunnel emerged 8 feet from the large oak tree in the woods. German Gunnery Tactics, 1917. Not a year. 1917. Military time. 7:17 in the evening. The exact time David had broken the surface. Croft wasn't just a traitor. He was an arrogant one. He was using his library requests, a seemingly innocuous part of camp life, to pass detailed, multi-part intelligence to the commandant. Oberst Bauer, the dandy who appreciated literature, would receive the list. His adjutant would then cross-reference it with the prearranged code, and they would have everything they needed. To prove it, Alastair needed to intercept a live message. He couldn't risk swiping the note and arousing Croft's suspicion. He had to think like a spy. He approached Arthur, the quiet, unassuming librarian, a man he trusted implicitly. He didn't reveal the full extent of his suspicions, only that he believed secret messages were being passed, and he needed Arthur's help for a sting operation. Arthur, whose hatred for the Germans was a quiet but intensely burning fire, agreed without hesitation. The plan was simple. The next time Croft dropped off a request list, Arthur was to signal Alastair. Alastair had prepared a duplicate slip of paper. He would quickly transcribe the list onto his own slip, and Arthur would swap them, passing Croft's original to Alastair and filing the copy. It was risky. Croft might notice the different handwriting, but Arthur's scrawl was notoriously messy, giving them a thin veil of plausibility. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Croft sauntered into the library, spent an hour with a volume of poetry, and dropped his request slip on Arthur's desk on his way out. Arthur, polishing his spectacles, gave the prearranged signal, a nervous cough. Alastair, browsing the history section, felt his pulse quicken. The swap was executed in less than 10 seconds. It was clumsy, nerve-wracking, but successful. Croft left, oblivious. Alastair held the original slip in his hand, the paper feeling electric to the touch. It contained 2 titles. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. The Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll. He rushed back to his corner of the barracks, his mind a fever of decryption. A Tale of Two Cities. London and Paris. 2 men, 2 targets. No, too simple. It was a major new escape plan, one Alastair had just learned about himself. The camp's official escape committee was planning its most audacious breakout yet, a mass escape of 20 men through a new tunnel, codenamed Atlas. The plan was to split the escapees into 2 groups heading in different directions. 2 cities, 2 groups. Then, The Hunting of the Snark, a nonsense poem about a hunt for an imaginary creature. This was Croft's flourish, his little joke. He was telling the commandant that this grand escape plan was a fiction, a snark hunt, something the Germans shouldn't worry about. It was a bluff. Croft was trying to downplay the significance of the escape to the commandant, likely to increase his own value later on. Or perhaps he was planning to betray one group while letting the other go as a diversion. Alistair stared at the note, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a sickening finality. He had him. He had the proof. This slip of paper was Croft's death warrant, signed in his own arrogant, coded hand. Standing there in the cold, damp air of the hut, Alistair felt a profound shift within himself. The mission was no longer about mourning David. The hot, messy grief had been replaced by the cold, clean mechanics of vengeance. But as he looked at the evidence, he realized something crucial. He couldn't just take this to the SBO. He couldn't simply have Croft executed by the camp's secret internal tribunal. That was too easy. It was too much like the enemy's justice, and it wouldn't bring him the closure he craved. Violence was a German tool. Croft had betrayed the code of honor, the very fabric of their society in the camp. Therefore, his punishment had to come from that code. Alistair wouldn't use a knife or a garrote. He would use the camp's own system of honor as his weapon. He wouldn't just destroy the man, he would dismantle his identity, his standing, his very place among them. He would engineer Croft's downfall in a way that was public, irrefutable, and left him utterly, morally ruined. It would be a form of justice David, the stickler for fair play, would have appreciated. The hunt was over. The trap was about to be set. Now, you might be thinking this is where the story gets brutal, where Alistair arranges a quiet, grim fate for the traitor in the dark. But that's what makes this story so chilling. Alistair realized that physical harm would be a release for a man like Croft. It would make him a martyr in his own mind. What Alistair had planned was far more cruel and far more just. Wait until you hear what happens next. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Now, let's get back to Offlog 7C. The news of the Atlas escape rippled through the camp's inner circles with a renewed sense of purpose. It was to be the largest, most organized breakout ever attempted from Offlog 7C. 20 men, including several high-value pilots and intelligence officers, would go out through a new tunnel being dug under the chapel, a location deemed almost sacred and therefore less likely to be searched. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, a testament to the prisoner's unyielding spirit. For most, it was a beacon of hope. For Alistair, it was the perfect stage for his revenge. He intercepted another of Croft's library notes. This one was more direct. Dante's Inferno, Journey to the Center of the Earth. The meaning was chillingly clear. Dante's 9 Circles of Hell. The tunnel exit was in Sector 9 of the camp's grid map. Journey to the Center of the Earth, a detailed report on the tunnel's depth and length. Croft was no longer being coy. He was providing a full intelligence briefing. But then Alistair discovered the true extent of Croft's treachery. Through his network of trusted whispers, he learned the price of this information. Croft wasn't just trading for cigarettes and warm blankets anymore. He had negotiated the ultimate prize, a transfer. He was to be moved to a hospitality camp, a comfortable, loosely guarded estate used for high-value prisoners the Germans hoped to use for propaganda. He was selling out 20 of his countrymen for a life of ease while the war raged on. The deadline was set. Atlas was scheduled for the next new moon, just 3 weeks away. Croft would make his final report the night before the escape, after which he would be quietly removed from the camp. Alistair now had the ticking clock he needed. He had to expose Croft before he could betray the Atlas escapees and disappear forever. And he had to do it in a way that didn't compromise the escape itself. If he revealed Croft's betrayal too early, the Germans would know their source was compromised and would crack down on the entire camp, placing Atlas in jeopardy. This was the razor's edge he had to walk. He had to let Croft believe his betrayal was succeeding, right up to the final moment. He had to allow him to pass his final, damning piece of intelligence, but in a way that it became the very instrument of his downfall. The plan that began to form in Alistair's mind was audacious, complex, and deeply psychological. It was a masterpiece of revenge, tailored specifically to his enemy. He would not expose a traitor. He would let the traitor expose himself. The first step was to control the information. Alistair went to Wing Commander Davies, the SBO. He presented his case, not as a vengeful friend, but as the head of the Coded Communications Committee. He laid out the evidence calmly, logically, the German cigarette, the coded library notes, the timeline of Croft's escalating privileges. He explained his theory about the impending betrayal of Atlas. Davies, a man who had seen the best and worst of human nature, listened in stony silence, his face grim. When Alastair finished, the SBO stared out the small, grimy window of his office for a long time. "Your friend David," he said finally, his voice low. "He was a good man. What Croft has done, it is a violation of everything we stand for." He turned to face Alastair, his eyes like chips of flint. "What do you propose?" "I propose we let him do it, sir," Alastair said, his voice steady. "We let him pass the final details of the Atlas escape to the Commandant, but we change the details. We feed him false information. A false exit point, a false date." Davies raised an eyebrow. "A dangerous game, Finch, if the Germans sense a deception." "They won't, sir, because the information will come from several sources, all seemingly confirming each other. And it will culminate in a way that leaves Croft no room to deny it." Alastair then laid out the rest of his plan. It was not just about feeding Croft false information. It was about creating a public spectacle. He proposed a camp-wide debate, a common enough event to keep morale up. But this one would be different. The topic: the ethics of survival. At what point does pragmatism become treachery? It would be a mandatory event, attended by every officer in the camp. And it would be chaired by Wing Commander Davies himself. Davies understood immediately. It was to be a court-martial disguised as a philosophical discussion. A trial by one's peers held in the open. "And Croft?" Davies asked. "He will be invited to be a keynote speaker, sir," Alastair replied with a cold smile. "To argue the side of pragmatism. Given his philosophical leanings, it's a role he will relish. A chance to show off his intellectual superiority." The plan was set in motion. The trap was being constructed, piece by meticulous piece. Alastair, with the SBO's blessing, now had the resources of the camp's leadership behind him. They carefully crafted the false intelligence for the Atlas escape. The exit point was changed from the chapel grounds to the disused laundry building. The date was moved forward by 2 days. This false information was then subtly leaked in places where Croft was sure to find it. A faked entry in the escape committee's logbook, a casual conversation, overheard between 2 plotters, a deliberately careless map left on a table. It was a web of deceit, and Croft walked right into it, greedily snapping up every piece of bait. Alastair watched as Croft compiled his new intelligence, preparing his final, triumphant report for the Commandant. The man was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. The stage was set. The audience was about to assemble, and the star of the show had no idea he was about to play the part of the condemned man. As Alastair's web tightened around him, Croft wasn't entirely oblivious. He couldn't pinpoint the source of his unease, but he could feel a change in the camp's atmosphere. He sensed the shift in the currents of whispers and sideways glances. He didn't suspect the truth. His ego wouldn't allow it, but he recognized a threat. And he identified, correctly, that the nexus of this threat was Alastair Finch. The once-broken man was no longer shuffling in despair. There was a new light in Alastair's eyes, a cold, focused intensity that made Croft deeply uncomfortable. He saw Alastair speaking in hushed tones with men he had previously avoided, men like Arthur the librarian, and even some of the SBO's own adjutants. Croft decided to strike first, to neutralize the threat before it could manifest. He was a man who understood power, and in the camp, power was wielded through influence and accusation. His position on multiple committees, including the one that oversaw the distribution of Red Cross parcels, gave him leverage. His first move was subtle. He used his influence to have Alastair's meager rations cut. Officially, it was a clerical error, a mix-up in the hut rosters. But Alastair knew it was a warning shot. His daily slice of black bread became thinner, his portion of watery soup smaller. The gnawing hunger that was a constant companion to every prisoner became a sharp, debilitating pain. It was a classic tactic of attrition, designed to weaken him, to break his focus. But the move backfired. The physical hardship only sharpened Alastair's resolve, burning away any last vestiges of doubt or hesitation. He shared his already reduced rations with the small circle of men who were now in on his plan, forging their loyalty not with promises, but with shared sacrifice. They, in turn, slipped him what they could, a potato from their own meal, a crust of bread. The act of solidarity, the very thing Croft had betrayed, became Alastair's source of strength. Seeing that simple deprivation wasn't working, Croft escalated. He decided to frame Alastair, to discredit him so completely that no one would ever listen to him again. The camp had recently received a large shipment of Red Cross parcels, a treasure trove of condensed milk, chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. These parcels were guarded more jealously than crown jewels. Stealing from the common store was the gravest of sins, second only to collaboration. Croft orchestrated the theft himself. He used his access to the storeroom to remove a small crate of supplies. Then, through a crony, a weak-willed officer he had been grooming with small favors, he arranged for the crate to be planted under Alastair's bunk in the middle of the night. The next morning, the crony discovered the theft and, feigning reluctance, suggested that they search the barracks. The search was a tense, humiliating affair. The camp's internal police, a group of burly, no-nonsense officers, went from bunk to bunk. Alastair stood by, his face a calm, unreadable mask, his heart pounding. He knew what was happening. He could see the triumphant smirk playing at the corners of Croft's mouth as he stood by the door, observing the proceedings with a look of detached concern. When they reached Alastair's bunk, the planted crate was discovered. A collective gasp went through the hut. The men looked from the crate to Alastair, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a moment, Croft's plan seemed to have worked perfectly. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. But Alastair was prepared. The pressure had forced him to be more careful, to anticipate Croft's moves. He had confided in Wing Commander Davies, who had in turn given a quiet, coded instruction to the head of the camp police. "Well, Finch, what do you have to say for yourself?" the lead officer demanded, his voice hard. Alastair looked not at the officer, but directly at Croft. "I say this is a convenient discovery. Wouldn't you agree, Captain?" he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent hut. Almost as convenient as a hand-rolled German cigarette appearing near a betrayed tunnel. A flicker of panic appeared in Croft's eyes. It was a direct hit, a piece of information that only the traitor could understand the significance of. Before Croft could respond, the camp police officer held up a hand. "One moment." He bent down and examined the crate. He lifted it slightly. "That's odd," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This crate, it's been marked with the storeroom inventory stamp for Hut 12 on the bottom. We are in Hut 17. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room. The only person with access to the inventory stamps and the freedom to move between the huts this morning was the officer overseeing the distribution. His eyes landed squarely on Captain Julian Croft. "Weren't you on duty in the storeroom this morning, Captain?" The triumphant smirk on Croft's face vanished, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. The trap he had set for Alastair had just snapped shut on his own leg. He began to stammer, to bluster, talking about mistakes and clerical errors, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, not about Alastair, but about him. The other prisoners looked from the crate to Croft, and the narrative began to shift. The pieces started to connect in their minds. Croft's extra comforts, his arrogant demeanor, and now this blatant, clumsy attempt to frame a man who had just lost his best friend. The immediate threat to Alastair was neutralized. The framing attempt had failed spectacularly, turning suspicion back onto the accuser. But it had also raised the stakes. Croft was now desperate. He knew Alastair was onto him, and he knew his time was running out. He would be more dangerous than ever. For Alastair, this was the final confirmation. Croft was not just a coward, he was a cornered rat, and a cornered rat will do anything to survive. The quiet, psychological war had just turned personal and immediate. The philosophical debate on the ethics of survival was no longer an academic exercise. It was a countdown to a final, public confrontation. Alastair had solidified his allies, he had weathered the storm, and now all that was left was to spring the trap. The day of the great debate arrived, cloaked in a damp, gray chill that seeped into the bones. The camp's theater hut, a drafty wooden building that usually hosted bad Shakespeare and hopeful sing-alongs, was packed to the rafters. Attendance was mandatory. Every British officer in Offlog 7C was there, their faces a pale sea of anticipation. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and a palpable, humming tension. This was more than just a diversion. Everyone could feel it. This was an event. At the front of the hall, a long table was set up on the low stage. Wing Commander Davies sat in the center, his presence radiating a solemn authority. To his right sat Alastair, calm and composed, a sheaf of notes in front of him. To his left was an empty chair. Captain Julian Croft was making a deliberately late entrance, a final, petty display of his self-importance. Finally, the door at the back of the hall opened and Croft entered. He strolled down the central aisle with a practiced nonchalance, a slim leather-bound book tucked under his arm. He was dressed immaculately, his uniform a stark contrast to the worn-out battle dress of the other men. He looked every bit the sophisticated intellectual, ready to educate the unwashed masses. He took his seat, gave Alastair a condescending nod, and opened his book. Wing Commander Davies stood up. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. "We are here today to discuss a topic of some gravity, the ethics of survival. In our current circumstances, we are all forced to make choices. Where is the line between a necessary compromise and a betrayal of one's principles? At what point does the instinct for self-preservation become a crime against one's comrades?" He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Captain Croft has graciously agreed to open our debate, arguing the case for pragmatic survival. Flight Lieutenant Finch will present the counterargument for absolute moral integrity." Croft stood, a smug smile on his face. He launched into a polished, eloquent speech filled with philosophical quotes and historical allusions. He spoke of the greater good, of the futility of empty gestures, and the intelligent man's duty to adapt to his environment. He argued that in a lost war, blind adherence to an outdated code of honor was not noble, but suicidal. It was a masterful performance, a rationalization of cowardice dressed up in the robes of intellectual superiority. He was, in effect, justifying his own treason without confessing to it. "To sacrifice oneself for a failed ideal is not heroism," he concluded, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It is vanity. True survival, the kind that allows one to live to fight another day, or simply to live, requires a more flexible morality." He sat down to a sparse, uncertain applause. The men were discomfited, his words a direct challenge to the very foundation of their resilience. Then it was Alastair's turn. He walked to the center of the stage, but he didn't address the audience. He looked directly at Croft. "A compelling argument, Captain," Alastair began, his voice quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "Flexibility, pragmatism, but let's move from the abstract to the concrete." He held up a single hand-rolled cigarette. "This brand of cigarette, for example, a luxury in this camp, a known favorite of the commandant. A pragmatic man might find a way to acquire such luxuries. A small trade, perhaps, information in exchange for comfort." Croft's smile tightened. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. "No," Alastair continued, his tone hardening. "Let's talk about another pragmatic tool, coded messages. A man could, for instance, use library request slips to pass information. He could use book titles to convey numbers, the 39 steps to mean 39 degrees, the 27-year Peloponnesian War to denote the 27th man, a Gallic War of 8 years to signify 8 feet from the oak tree, and a gunnery manual from 1917 to mean 1917 hours, the exact details of a certain failed escape tunnel." A deathly silence fell over the hall. Every eye was locked on Croft, whose face had gone pale. He was starting to sweat. He looked to Wing Commander Davies for help, but the SBO's face was a mask of cold fury. "These are insane accusations," Croft blustered, finding his voice. "You're a madman, Finch. Grief has destroyed your reason. You have no proof." "Proof," Alastair said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You want proof, Julian. Let's talk about the Atlas escape. A very pragmatic man would see that as the ultimate bargaining chip, a final trade for a comfortable life. He would compile a report for the commandant. He might even write it down to ensure the details are correct. He would be very careful with such a document. He wouldn't leave it in his bunk, of course. Too risky. He'd hide it somewhere clever. Somewhere no one would ever think to look." Alastair paused, letting the tension build. "Somewhere, for example, like the hollowed-out interior of a leather-bound book of German poetry." He pointed to the book, sitting on the table in front of Croft. It was a bluff, A spectacular, high-stakes gamble. Alastair had no idea if Croft had hidden the information in that specific book. He was betting on the man's arrogance, his theatricality, his need to keep his trophies close. For a terrifying second, Croft stared at him, his mind racing. Then his nerve broke. His eyes darted to the book, a panicked, involuntary glance that was a confession in itself. He made a move to grab it, to protect it. But it was too late. Wing Commander Davies' hand shot out and clamped down on the book. "I believe this is now evidence," he said, his voice like the cracking of ice. He opened the book. Tucked between the pages was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a detailed, handwritten report. On it was the false information about the Atlas escape, the wrong date, the wrong exit point. At the bottom, it was signed, Captain J. Croft. A wave of pure, visceral hatred washed through the hall. The sound was a low growl, the collective rage of 1,000 men who had been betrayed. Croft stared at the paper, then at the faces of his peers, and he saw no mercy. He was finished. Davies held up a hand for silence. "There will be no violence," he commanded. "We are not the enemy, we are British officers." He turned his burning gaze on Croft. "But you, sir, are no longer one of us. You have betrayed the badge you wear and the men you served with. As of this moment, you are stripped of your rank. You are no longer Captain Croft. You are nothing. You are morally dead." The Germans, who had been informed of the debate and its likely outcome by Davies an hour earlier, arrived as if on cue. They did not see a valuable informant. They saw a pariah, a man utterly useless to them now, hated by his own and a liability to theirs. They didn't take him to a hospitality camp. They didn't even take him to the solitary confinement cells. They simply left him, stranded in a sea of his own countrymen, every one of whom now looked at him with utter contempt. He was invisible. Men walked past him as if he wasn't there. No one would speak to him, look at him, or acknowledge his existence. His food was left outside the hut door, untouched. He was ostracized, a ghost in the machine, condemned to a solitary confinement of the soul, far more torturous than any physical prison. Alastair watched the man's complete social annihilation and felt nothing. There was no joy, no satisfaction, no triumphant thrill of victory. There was only a grim, hollow sense of restored order. This cold emptiness was not the closure he had sought. 2 nights later, under the true new moon, the Atlas escape went ahead as originally planned. 20 men, Alastair among them, slipped out through the tunnel beneath the chapel. As he crawled through the dark, damp earth, the same suffocating darkness that had claimed David, Alastair finally understood. His revenge on Croft hadn't been for him. It had been for the community, a necessary surgery to remove a cancer. His closure, his personal peace, lay here in the dirt, continuing the mission. He was finishing what he and David had started. He was honoring his friend not by destroying his betrayer, but by upholding the very ideals of courage and defiance that David had embodied. As he emerged into the cool, free air of the Bavarian night, Alastair looked back at the grim silhouette of Offlog 7C. He thought of Croft, the man who was no one, entombed in a prison of his own making. And for the first time since David's death, Alastair Finch felt a flicker of something that wasn't cold or hard or hollow. It was the faint, warm glow of peace. He had found his justice, not in an act of revenge, but in an act of defiant hope. So, what do you think? Alastair chose a path of psychological ruin over physical violence. He understood that for a man like Croft, being forgotten was a punishment worse than death. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That true justice sometimes isn't about an eye for an eye, but about completely erasing the person from the world they so desperately wanted to be a part of. What would you have done in Alastair's shoes? Would you have sought a more brutal form of revenge, or do you think he found the perfect justice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching Revenge Pains, and I'll see you in the next story.